The story goes that an inland tribe had recently seen many converts come to Christianity. The nearby tribe had sent a missionary, a church planter, if you will, to that tribe, and they responded to the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they taught them those new Christians just kind of what it meant to be to practice the private devotions, that is, reading the Bible and praying. That inland tribe, each one had a separate spot that they would go to in the thicket. And that's where they would pour out their heart and prayer as they would pray for their spouse or their children or other people there in their village to come to faith in Jesus. And over time, then those paths to the places where they would pray became well-worn. In fact, what they would often, as a result, if one of those believers began to neglect prayer, it would be soon apparent to others because grass would kind of grow back, and they would kindly remind each other with this phrase, "Brother, the grass grows on your path." It was just kind of a subtle, gentle way of saying, hey, make sure that you're praying. I wonder this morning if the figurative grass on our prayer path has become overgrown because of prayerlessness. I want to encourage this morning the single parent who's trying to make ends meet. I want to speak to the grandparent here of an unbelieving grandchild. I want to encourage the heart of a parent with a wayward child. I want to speak to the couple who have had their fifth blow-up argument in just as many days. I want to talk to the individual who longs for deeper community, friendships. And I want to speak to the Christian who seems that even though they know Jesus and they sing about the chains being gone, that the addiction seems to hold them tighter and tighter as the weeks and months go by. I've titled our message this morning, Jesus' Twin Truths on Prayer. Jesus' twin truths. There's two stories in Luke 18, and these paired parables are the dual realities in which God answers his children. And so there's only two truths or 2 points this morning. Here's truth number one. It's found in verse 1 of Luke chapter 18. And it reads this way: He told them a parable, a story to the effect that they ought always to pray and not lose heart. The first truth that we see in our text here this morning is pray persistently, for we are in need of answers. But Jesus tells a story as to why we wouldn't pray persistently. What would keep us, what would hinder us from praying like we ought? He tells a story of polar opposites. He tells a story of a cold, calculating judge, an apparently unjust judge, and a penniless widow who must persistently argue her own case of justice before this unjust judge. And the judge is unmoved and has no desire to even interfere in any way, to involve himself in this case of injustice with this widow woman. In fact, he says there's only one reason why he even changed his mind. It's found in verse 4. Look at Luke 18, verse 4. It says, for a while he refused, the judge refused, but afterward he said to himself, though I neither fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will give her justice so that she will not beat me down by her continual coming. That last phrase there, beat me down, right there. You could literally translate it, give me a black eye. This unjust judge was scared of getting handbagged by this elderly widow woman. He didn't want a black eye. He wanted to kind of get her out of his life. You see, in Jesus' story, the parallels are this, is that God is the judge, and it is we who are the widow woman. Now, this is a bit unsettling, right? Because Mosier, you just said that this was an unjust judge who is cold and calculating, who seems unmoved by people's dilemmas of life, and yet you're telling me that this Jesus is telling a story in which God is the judge and we are the widow. That's exactly what I'm saying. But there is a device in Eastern literature or Eastern rhetoric. Basically, it's known as the lesser to greater argument. And Jesus uses this device of rhetoric or of literature all the time throughout the Gospels. That the idea of using an argument from lesser to greater, here's what I mean. That is, if the judge is the lesser in the story, if the judge is a certain way, unjust, unmoving, cold, calculating, the corresponding person in the story, in the similar role, is greater. If the judge is the lesser, the corresponding person in the same story, in the role in the story, is greater. This is a device known as a lesser to greater argument. And this is exactly what Jesus does then in verse 6. The Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge says. Do you hear that, disciples? Verse 7, and will not God give justice to his elect who cry to him day and night? Will he delay longer over them? I tell you, he will give them justice. Jesus uses language here. He says, God's elect. Will he not respond to his own elect? That is language borrowed from Jesus' Bible we know as the Old Testament. Who are the elect of the Old Testament? It's the nation of Israel. Just as God sovereignly, supernaturally provided and protected for his chosen people, Jesus says he will do the same for his elect. But we know that as we move into the new covenant, that God's people are not known by their ethnicity. They're not known by their nationality. What are they known by? They are known by their confession of who is king in their life. And so Jesus says, if this unjust judge will respond, how much more will your Father respond for his elect? The persecuted minority will experience justice by God himself. Christian, I want you to hear this loud and clear. I want you to know that this God of heaven will take up your cause. The word elect or election is not some teaching to be embarrassed of or to run away. According to Jesus, this idea of elect or election, it actually is a bedrock foundation on which we actually cry out to God. Like we cry out to God because of this relationship of being elect. Our Father is unlike this unjust judge. That is, while this unjust judge slowly handed down a verdict for fear of getting a black eye, our Father in heaven brings justice. Did you see that word in verse 8? Look at it again. I tell you, Jesus says, he, God the Father, will give justice to them speedily. Now, it is at this point that you may want to argue, because I want to argue with the text, and I did argue this past week. Speedily? Speedily? God, I can think of a lot of things that I've prayed for in my life and I've asked justice for, and speedily is not one adjective that I would use, right? This is not my experience. Speedily, or maybe your translation says quickly. In fact, Joel, I'm just kind of arguing with the text here for a moment. Jesus says we ought always to pray and not lose heart. So it seems to indicate that Jesus knows that I'm going to lose heart, right? So if Jesus is using this illustration, this whole scenario, doesn't that seem to indicate that God's timeliness isn't as quick as Jesus' teaching is? Right? That's kind of the struggle as I'm reading through this, right? That God will give justice to them speedily. The simple answer to this, and it's just that, it's a simple answer, it doesn't resolve all the tension, is to say this, is that God's timeline is not my timeline. I operate on a 12-month calendar. I operate on a 7-day week with 24 hours in a day. That God is outside of time. That God does not kind of put his calendar according to the Hallmark calendar. Christmas, Thanksgiving, Mother's Day, Father's Day. Lord, I really need you to do this by such and such a date. That's not the way God functions. It's not the way God works. The Father doesn't operate by my calendar or by my schedule. In fact, if we're honest, we like to judge God by a stopwatch, right? There are prophecies that are given in your Old Testament that the prophets will say, and this will come to pass quickly. It takes a couple hundred years. Some cases, it takes millennia. My simple point is this, is that Jesus says speedily, but his calendar and my calendar are not always the same. I'm reminded of this idea of that we ought always to pray and not lose heart every time I drink coffee in the morning. Let me show you what I mean. This is the mug that I enjoy. This is one of the mugs that I enjoy drinking out of for a variety of reasons. All right, I'll spare you my thought process about how coffee mugs should feel and all that. But this is the one that I like. You can see that there's a little bit of writing here, and you barely see a little bit of writing back there. Here's what the original mug looked like. It says, by faith. This was our giving campaign when we started it 3 years ago for this building. On the back side is the same in Spanish. There have been many a day where I have thought about this by faith, not just the giving campaign when we built this building, but just life in general, where I feel like this actually is a better testimony of what my faith feels like. And if you were to open up my heart, you'd say, yeah, Mosier, that's what it looks like too. That this is our experience. This is, to be honest, in some cases, our reality. And Jesus is saying this, is that as this happens, what should you do? You ought to always pray and not lose heart. You ought always to keep going before the Father. Well, why would I do that? I would do that because he is as we sang this morning, a good Father who gives justice to his children, who answers their prayers speedily. And behind this is a deeper teaching for all of us. That is, the widow in the story represents God's people. It represents God's people in this world who are helpless against the assaults of the adversary. In fact, the word used here is the exact same language used of the devil in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. This parable pictures a child of God who has suffered at the hands of Satan, but as a believer, he or she does have a place to go. Jesus is saying to you, friend, that there is a court of appeals. That there is a higher court with a truly just judge. And I'll let you in on a little secret, that you actually have a relationship with this just judge because of your lawyer who is Christ himself. You got an in. You know the judge. And so I say to you this, Grace Life, when this world beats against you, there is a righteous judge. We echo the words of Abraham from Genesis chapter 18, shall not the just judge of the earth do right? In fact, I think of church history. I can think of modern history even to this day. I think back to Dr. King and the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s. It was prayer. Yes, it was action, but it was prayer that moved a country. When I think of our brothers and sisters in the Middle East who, while we sit here and sing loudly and proudly and with our hands raised and turn the volume up, I think of them singing quietly, hiding for fear and praying that God would bring justice. At the end of this parable, we find a curious question. Look at the last half of verse 8. He says, I tell you, he will give justice to them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? What is Jesus saying here? Jesus is saying there are some prayers that you're going to have to keep on praying until Jesus himself returns. There are some prayers that you will pray till the day you die, and your faith will not have been made sight this side of heaven. That you will have to continue to pursue in prayer the Father's face, pleading for the cause in the case of justice. That is, persistent prayer is persistent faith to the end. When our eyesight isn't as clear as it once was, and our minds aren't as clear as they once were, I want you to be assured of who prays for you. For listen to the words from Hebrews chapter 7, where it says, consequently, because of all that, Jesus is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him. That's good, but this is gooder, all right? Don't tell the Goodson teachers I said that. Since he always lives to make intercession for them. Here's the reality. The reality as you hear me say this, you say, Joel, that's a lot easier to teach than it is to practice. I'm with you. I'm saying amen to that. But here's the reality of Hebrews chapter 7. That is, even when we ourselves are faithless and do not pray as we ought, who is there praying on our behalf? It's not that just Jesus saves you to kind of get you your ticket to heaven and says, I'll see you in eternity. It says in Hebrews chapter 7 that he always lives to make intercession for them. Who's the them? Those who he saves. Who does he save? His elect. Who are his elect? Those who will call upon Jesus in faith. That's who he prays for. And so you may have been prayerless this past week, but your high priest was praying for you. You see, pray. Pray persistently. Why? Because we are in need of answers. And then we come to the second story in our text. It's found in verse 9, and Jesus is going to state up front again what the point is of this story. Verse 9, he also told this parable, another parable, to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. So here's the second truth, second reality, is pray humbly, for we are in need of mercy. Pray persistently, for we are in need of answers. And secondly, pray humbly, for we are in need of mercy. Jesus, again, uses the polarities. He uses two men who are polar opposites of one another, societally. And it is actually the most likely one who becomes the focus and even the hero of the story. There's one man who's a Pharisee. The Pharisees stood as a separatist movement within the nation of Israel. They still were venerated by the people because of their loyalty to the land, a patriotic group, and their loyalty to the temple, a religious group. And so even though they were hardcore, they were venerated. They insisted, as we know, on meticulous observance of the law. But let's be honest, it wasn't just meticulous observance of the law. They had what they called fence laws. You know what a fence law is? It's laws that you set up to protect you from the real issue over here. They were the original legalists. Numerous illustrations could be given and to demonstrate how they fenced the law through their traditions. I think I've given this one before, but I think it's helpful. There was a practice in the Old Testament where they had to, before they could worship, before they could participate in religious observances, that they had to go through ceremonial washing, ceremonial cleansing. And precisely, the ceremonial cleansing, that was the command. But the Pharisees are the ones who elaborated on the details of what it actually meant to be cleansed or to be washed. And so the Pharisaical law went something like this, that they had to take, and I don't know how they came up with this, but they had to take 1.5 eggshells of water. You can read this. You can go online. And what they would do is they would take that water and they would pour it with their fingers pointed up, that 1.5 eggshells. This is ceremonial. It's not actually meant to cleanse away dirt or anything like that. It's completely ceremonial. They would do it this way, and the water would run down, and they would kind of daub and the water, the excess water. The second part of the washing, again, was with 1.5 eggshells, and this time it was their fingers pointed down, because the reason why they did it a second time is because that dirty water, there may still be stains left over, and so they would turn their hand upside down and then cleanse their hands with 1.5 eggshells of water. So that this time, that if there potentially any dirty water was still there, it would be washed off and would drip. This was the practice. Was this stipulated in the Bible? No, it was not. But principle had turned to application. Application had turned to law, and now law became the new definition of godliness for the Pharisees. And so when Jesus tells this story of an imaginary, or tells the story of a Pharisee, the imagery of a Pharisee, it's to be of that of a supremely religious man. Someone with whom people would venerate and even respect, even for the oddities and the excess to which they went to. The other man is a tax collector. He's a pariah of the people. He was despised and hated by the Jewish culture at large. You could go no lower socially than the tax collector. For you see, while under Roman domination, the Jews had many taxes placed upon them. There was the poll tax, there was the personal property tax, there was the export tax, the import tax, the tolls at the harbors, the roads, the bridges, the city gates. Kind of sounds like driving around Houston sometimes, doesn't it, there? You see, rather than sending Roman officials, the Romans would contract their work out to Jewish people. And they would be an agreed upon amount based upon the population and the roads and the access and the amount of inventory that was going in and out of the harbors. They would figure out a tax, and they would say to that person, there would kind of be bidding wars about how you would get this area. And so the Jewish persons would agree to the amount that was owed to the Roman government. And, oh yeah, guess what? By the way, the money that you're going to live on is anything you can get above and beyond that amount. You can see it was a system that was rife for deceit, for treachery, for dishonesty. It was an unscrupulous business practice just to go into a business like this. You could go no lower in Jewish society than a tax collector. You could go no lower. In fact, even tax collectors were so ostracized that they weren't even allowed to enter certain portions there of the temple. In the eyes of many, they sold their souls to the highest bidder. So Jesus puts up these two men of polar opposites. We see this in verse 10. Look at verse 10. The two men are offering up two prayers. Verse 10, two men went up into the temple to pray. One, a Pharisee, and the other, a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like the other men. Extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or I imagine him motioning with his hand, even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. The Pharisee's righteousness was one of comparison. His eyes were lifted to the heavens. He was not like this other man. He was not an extortioner. He was not unjust. He was not an adulterer. He most certainly was not like this tax collector. And Jesus is going after the core of a deadly disease that can affect many of us. That somehow God is obligated to answer my prayers because of who I am. And specifically, not just because of who I am, but who I am in comparison to, and then you fill in the blank with whomever. Kanye could never be saved. That type of stuff. Self-righteousness like that. Self-righteousness that takes place through comparison. Let's just keep it in house here for a moment. Well, you know, their preaching over there isn't expository like it is ours. The Pharisees' prayer was a prayer of, look at me. God, don't you wish more people were like me? Well, you know, if he or she knew his Bible as well as I do, that certainly wouldn't have happened to them. It's a prayer of comparison. Self-righteousness is an act of comparison. But may I remind us, Grace Life, we know this, but arrogance is not a Christian value. Arrogance is not a fruit of the Spirit. You shouldn't hang around people like that. And thankfully, this was not our Lord's response, right? Or, you know, if they just worked a little bit harder, they wouldn't be in that situation to begin with. But may I remind us, Christian, that compassion is a hallmark of Christ's disciples. And so the Pharisee continues on with this comparison as I fast and I tithe. The command to fast, you realize this, that the Jewish people were commanded to fast, yes, but they were commanded to fast once a year on the Day of Atonement. That was the one day that they were commanded to fast. Certainly this Pharisee for fasting twice a week, I mean, this goes far and above and beyond the average Jewish person. His tithing was no doubt down to the mint leaf because Jesus had referenced that. How refreshing is this tax collector's prayer? Look at verse 13. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. There is something refreshing, isn't there? Not to puff any of the four of you up who gave your stories. But there's something refreshing when people own their sin. Just said, that's me. But Jesus is greater. There's something refreshing about people who confess their own weakness of faith, their own weakness to believe, but they say, you know what, though I cannot hold on to Jesus, Jesus will hold on to me. There's three realities in this prayer, just really quickly. First of all, God. He says, God, the name for the one who is over me, the king over all. Not I over him, but he over me. In addressing this prayer to God, Jesus assumes that it is to his Father to whom we must give an account to, and it is only God who can truly forgive. You see that? That's why Jesus sets the story up the way it is that there's only one to whom you can go to actually ask confession for. Though I carry pastor or reverend before my name, you can't go to God through me. You can't get to God through me. You only get to God through one, that is Christ. Be merciful. God's response to this sinner because of the request is the opposite of justice. To request mercy, what does that mean? To request mercy is a confession of one's true condition before God. Why would I need mercy? I need mercy because I'm a sinner. This is why I need mercy. To request mercy means that if I receive justice, I'm in trouble. That mercy interjects, mercy intercepts, mercy interrupts, mercy intervenes. God, be merciful to whom? To me, a sinner. The tax collector identifies fundamentally as what? As a sinner. Not his Jewish ethnicity, not his vocation, but as a sinner. Oh, friend, if you are here today. Your fundamental identity can change on a dime. Your fundamental identity from that of being God's creation who sinned against him, who broke his laws, and therefore are under the justice of God. Your fundamental identity at that point is this: as a sinner who defies God. But the Christian gospel says there is better news. And the better news is this, is that you can go from a broken creation of God to be on confession of your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, can go to that of being reunited with the one whom we once rebelled against. This is what it means to pray, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. 2 prayers, 2 responses. And look how verse 14, Jesus wraps it up this way. I tell you, this man, the one who prayed that prayer, went down to his house justified, righteous, rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. There's no shame in confessing sin. The shame would be to hold on to it, right? Because the answer from God is this, is that when you humble yourselves, what do you get? You get grace. When you hold on to it, you lift yourself up in pride, you're resisted. You remember the beginning, the opening story, the story of the tribal people who had come to faith in Christ, who wore their prayer path to the ground because they used it so frequently. Remember, brother, the grass grows on your path. Christian, the fastest way to cut the grass on the proverbial prayer path is by mowing down the pride with what? With humble confession. And so the confession is this: yes, I am not like those others. I am far worse. You see, the question is not, is Kanye saved? Would God show mercy to Kanye? The question is, would God show mercy to me? That's the question. I am not like those others. Yes, I am far worse than those others. And so what opens the door, if you will, to God is to pray humbly and to pray persistently. And I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that I'm speaking to people as I speak, that the Spirit of God has said, yes, your prayer path is overgrown. It's been a long time. You've lost heart. And what you have received this morning, Grace Life, is this, is a kind word from your Father who is in heaven, who invites you back to the throne of grace to pray persistently and to pray humbly.